It was late, the streets nearly empty, as Robert drove his taxi through the quiet city. His mind was on the bills waiting at home, the repairs his old cab needed. Life was heavy, and every fare counted. But as he slowed down at the corner, he saw a woman, huddled by the streetlight, tears streaming down her face. She clutched a small child tightly to her chest, and though she didn't speak at first, her eyes said everything. Robert rolled down his window. "Do you need a ride?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice shaky. "Please, I don't have much." Without a second thought, Robert waved her in. As they drove, the woman quietly sobbed in the back seat, the little boy fast asleep in her arms. Robert didn't ask any questions. He could feel the weight of her troubles. When they arrived at her destination, a modest apartment building, she fumbled in her bag for some money. "Don't worry about it," Robert said, his voice softer than usual. He waved away her thanks and drove off, the image of her teary face stuck in his mind. Back home that night, Robert lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Why was she so upset? What had happened to bring her to that breaking point? He usually never refused payment, not when he needed every bit to survive, but something about her. Something just felt different. Just as his eyes were closing, his phone buzzed. Robert frowned at the glowing screen, wondering who could be calling this late. After a moment's hesitation, he picked up. "Robert," the taxi driver, came a calm voice on the other end, though there was an urgency behind it. "Yes, that's me," Robert replied, confused. "I'm calling on behalf of the woman you drove home tonight," the man said. "She's safe, but there's something we need to discuss." Robert sat up in bed, his heart beating faster. "What's this about?" The man on the phone explained that the woman, whose name was Ella, had come from a wealthy family, but had been estranged from them for years after a personal tragedy. Life had been hard for her, trying to make it on her own, and that night had been one of the lowest points of her struggle. "She didn't tell you, but what you did for her tonight, it meant more than you know," the man continued. "Her family has learned about your kindness, and they would like to meet you." Robert blinked in surprise, his mind racing. Why would this family want to meet him? All he had done was offer a free ride. But before he could ask, the man gave him an address and asked him to come by the next day. The following morning, Robert stood outside a grand house, the kind of place he had only driven by in the nicer parts of town. He'd never dreamed of setting foot inside one of these homes. His stomach tightened with nerves as he rang the bell. The door swung open, and Robert was greeted by an older man, sharply dressed in a tailored suit. "Robert, thank you for coming," the man said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I'm Lawrence, a family friend." Lawrence led Robert through the house, past elegant paintings and marble floors that gleamed under the soft lighting. Everything about the place screamed wealth, a world far from Robert's. In the sitting room, Ella stood as they entered, looking completely different from the woman he'd seen the night before. Her eyes, no longer red from crying, were filled with gratitude. "Robert," she began, stepping forward, "I don't even know how to thank you. Last night, I was at my lowest point. I had no idea how I was going to get through it, and then you showed up. You didn't ask for anything. You just helped me." Robert shifted, feeling a bit awkward under the weight of her gratitude. "It was nothing really," he mumbled, not used to being praised for something he saw as just the right thing to do. But Lawrence interrupted, his voice serious yet kind. "Robert, this family has faced its own tragedies. Wealth doesn't shield you from hardship. What you did for Ella last night reminded us that there are still good people in this world." Robert listened, stunned, as the weight of his simple act of kindness settled in. He had done something small, something he thought would go unnoticed, yet here he was, standing in a grand house, hearing how that one moment had made all the difference. Robert leaned in, listening intently, his brow furrowing in confusion as Lawrence spoke. The older man paused, his eyes searching Robert's face, choosing his next words carefully. "The family you helped, they're not just wealthy," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "They're influential, Robert. They own several businesses across the city. But more than that, they believe in giving back, to those who show kindness without expecting anything in return." Robert's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. His mind raced. Influential? He hadn't thought much about the woman's background. He didn't need to. All he saw that night was someone in pain, someone who needed help. Now, Lawrence's words were sinking in, and it felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. Lawrence continued, his tone softening, but steady. They've decided that your act of kindness, what you did for Ella, shouldn't go unnoticed. Robert shifted in his seat. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because it felt like the right thing to do. His mind was already replaying that night, the way Ella had looked so lost, clutching her child, her eyes swollen from tears. He remembered the moment he waved away the money she offered. It wasn't much, but at the time, something told him she needed it more than he did. They want to offer you a life-changing opportunity, Lawrence said, his voice breaking Robert's thoughts. Robert's heart thumped in his chest. Life-changing. His lips parted slightly as he looked up at Lawrence, the words catching in his throat. What could that possibly mean? He'd spent years driving, scrimping, saving, barely making ends meet. How could one night, one simple act, turn his world upside down like this? Lawrence explained further, his voice steady and reassuring. The family had decided to offer Robert a financial gift, enough to pay off every debt, every bill. Robert's breath hitched. And as if that wasn't enough, they were offering him a position within their company. A real job. A chance to build something stable, something lasting. A way out of the endless cycle of struggling to get by. Robert felt his head spin. His entire life, one built on long, exhausting hours, always wondering how he'd make it through the month, was now being unraveled before him. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for years seemed to lift, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Ella, who had been silent up until now, stood up slowly, her face soft, her eyes full of something deeper than gratitude. She approached him, her hands clasped in front of her. Robert, that night, you didn't know it, but you gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, she said, her voice gentle, but filled with emotion. You gave me hope. I felt like I had nothing left, but you showed me there's still good in the world. This is our way of saying thank you. Robert's throat tightened. He looked up at Ella, then over to Lawrence. He wanted to speak, to tell them that he never expected anything in return, but the words wouldn't come. All he had done was offer a ride and refuse money. That's it. And yet, here he was, being offered a future he could barely wrap his mind around. The meeting ended, and as Robert walked out of the grand house, the fresh air hit his face, cooling his heated thoughts. He stood still for a moment, glancing up at the sky, the enormity of the day settling on him. Was this really happening? He could hardly believe it, but the feeling in his chest told him it was real. The following days were a whirlwind. Robert stepped into his new job with cautious optimism. The work was tough at first, new routines, new faces, but soon he found his rhythm. Each day felt like a step away from his old life of struggle. The pressure of unpaid bills, the stress of uncertainty, they began to fade. In their place was something Robert hadn't felt in years. Security. More than the financial relief, though, it was the relationships that left the deepest mark. Ella and her family kept in touch, inviting him into their world, not just as a business partner, but as a friend. He found himself surrounded by people who valued him for who he was, not just for the help he had given that one night. One evening, after a long but fulfilling day at work, Robert sat alone in his small apartment, the quiet hum of the city filtering in through the window. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline, his thoughts drifting back to everything that had happened. It all started with a single act of kindness. Something so small had rippled out, touching his life in ways he could have never predicted. Robert smiled softly to himself. Life had been tough, no doubt about it. But through it all, he had never let go of his compassion for others. He realized now, more than ever, how true it was. Sometimes, the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. Not just on those you help, but on your own life as well. The kindness he had shown that night came back to him, like a wave returning to shore, carrying with it opportunities he had never imagined. And in the end, that kindness had given him something more valuable than money or success. It had given him a new path, and a second chance at life. If this story resonated with you and you're looking for more uplifting and inspiring tales, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's explore stories that highlight the incredible strength of the human spirit and the blessings life brings. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm excited to share more stories with you in the next video. Remember, embrace the positivity around you and believe in the incredible beauty of life. Let's keep inspiring one another.